So let's talk a bit about ground strafing and start zones. This works in CSS, Momentum, and I believe Gmod as well by default. Other games, namely TF2 and CSGO, some servers have plugins which emulate the behavior of ground strafing, but because they're plugins, they don't always behave exactly as expected. So you can see in these games anyway, the default ground speed without a weapon is 260 units per second, but you notice that if I start to turn, this changes, and it can go up or it can go down. And the reason for this is that to turn you, the game actually applies an acceleration vector to your character's velocity. And I'm not going to get into the details, but it should be pretty easy to connect the dots there, accounting for friction, why you actually are able to gain or lose speed. So I'm showing this in Momentum because Momentum is kind enough to show the speed that you have when you jump. Every time you leave the ground, it shows right under there, or right under the speedometer. You can see the speed I have when I leave the ground and jump. And so, of course, in surfing you want to have the most speed as possible all the time. So why would you leave the start zone, board the first ramp with a speed of 260 units per second when you could have a speed of, say, 282 or more, of course. And so here I've moved to KSF to show a couple other things. You can see the UI has changed up a little bit, but what I want to show here is how start zones work, and it's also pretty intuitive. You know, every map has a start zone and a map zone, and you can see that in the HUD below. It says zone map start, and now it says zone linear map, which means I'm in the map zone. This applies for stages and bonuses as well. You know, every stage, every bonus has a start and end zone and a stage zone. But the difficulty, of course, is where is that barrier? Where exactly is that barrier? And in most cases, on most maps, it is right along the ground here. In KSF, actually, if I do this command, show zones, I can see that. And that down there, that's a checkpoint zone, so we'll ignore that for now. But it's aligned right perfectly along the ground. So I've talked about maximizing speed, which is sort of the first aspect of doing a good start zone. But the second part, which is equally, if not more important, is minimizing your hang time in the zone. What that means is, I'll show you two examples. It should be pretty clear the difference here. If I just jump out and board the ramp versus if I do a careful pre-strafe to barely get over the ground. And hopefully it was clear. In the first one, there was a lot of hang time, a lot of time waiting, just spent falling to land on the ramp. Whereas in the second one, as soon as I'm in the zone, I'm on the ramp and I'm picking up speed. That's far more important. I calculated a while ago exactly how much time you spend in the air on an average jump, and I think it was about half a second. So if you can save half a second just by doing your start zones more effectively, then it's going to cut your overall times down quite. So the question then is, how do you know how good your start zone was? How can you work towards improvement? And the answer to that is most servers, as well as Momentum Mod, will tell you how much speed you have when you leave the start zone. And I'm going to be talking mostly about, or I've been talking about, standard start zones, meaning the box that you're in for the start zone is lined up perfectly with the ground. And again, there are exceptions to this, but most maps will see this. And that means that if you can get the perfect air strafe and get a perfect, you know, just barely get over the ground, so you minimize your hang time completely, the maximum speed you can get will be 475 units per second. Now, hitting a 475 unit per second start zone is extremely difficult. It's very rare to actually see one. Most really good world record stages and world record bonuses won't even have them. You'll see something about 460 to 470, or even as low as 450. But the difference between those is pretty small. A 450 unit per second start zone only loses about 0.03 to 0.05 seconds over a perfect 475 unit per second start zone. And now I'll talk very briefly about the other most common type of start zone, which I call a fall zone, meaning that this is stage 1 of Surf Overgrowth 2, which you can see the first round is right below us, so we have to fall right down on top of it. And it's just a hole we fall down through. And in this case, the start zone box is not aligned along the ground here, as you might expect. It's actually on this plane, on the plane of the ground. So as soon as you fall below ground height, your timer will start. And I can't show you this one because the zone doesn't actually show with the show zones command. In this case, there's no reason to barely make it over the ground and minimize your hang time, because no matter what, you're always going to have the same hang time. In these cases, you don't have to worry about cutting the ground as close to it as possible, and you should focus on maximizing your ground strafing speed and your air strafing speed as you fall through the start zone. These are generally pretty easier than regular start zones, just because you don't have to worry about that extra aspect of minimizing your hang time. And I'll end things by just showing a few more examples of some irregular start zones. Now, you don't see these kinds of things often. Like I said, in most cases it's just going to be aligned right along the ground, and you should worry about, cutting the ground as close as possible, maximizing your ground speed. But there are some maps, like Surf Beginner, where some very strange things happen, a lot of times because the map was zoned before some common conventions were put in place. So you can see Stage 1, a bit strange, Stage 2 is kind of the same business, Stage 3, all sorts of weird things happening here. And on these kinds of maps, you should generally look for what the stage record or the map record does to try to understand what to do, because most of the time the optimal route has already been figured out for you. Here on Happy Hands 3, there's an interesting start zone that you might see sometimes, kind of a hybrid start zone. So you can see the ground, there's not really much of a good place to put a start zone here, and so the way they do it actually is interesting. It extends over just a little bit, and you can see there's a little place you can fall through. So it looks like you might just want to do your regular business of cutting the ground as close as possible, but in this case it doesn't quite work like that, because you actually want to treat it like a fall zone by falling down through it instead of going out across it. And if you do that, you're actually going to get a much better start zone speed than you would if you did, or if you treated it like a regular start zone. So you can see right there, I got about 550 units per second, whereas if I did it like a regular one, I get 484. But as I said, these are not the normal case, and most of the time the route has been figured out for you. And so if you're ever in doubt, just check the replay or ask someone who knows what they're talking about and try to emulate that. And that's all I've got.